Every church wants to send missionaries, right? So why do so few pay the price?
During the recession of 2008, I was digging into the book of Acts, and the Spirit was doing these really deep things. And I got to Acts 13, this picture of the local church sending through the power and instruction of the Holy Spirit. I had a call to international missions. I went to my pastor. My pastor's like, yes, that's great. We sat down with several churches here in Louisville, and most of the pastors had the same response. This is a beautiful biblical picture, but for us to do this, we would have to turn our church upside down. And no one was willing to do it.
Pastor Nathan Sloan of Sojourn Midtown weighs in with some loving rebukes coming up in 1 minute. But first, a special message from ABWE President Paul Davis.
ABWE missionaries are coming beside the lost and the hurting around the world. And through the Global Gospel Fund, they're pulling people from the darkness and training them as leaders. They're planting churches, and they're even beginning their own missions movements. You may already support one ABWE missionary. Would you consider a gift to the Global Gospel Fund to support all 1,000 of our missionaries? Thank you for that.
Become a partner today at abwe.org/Global Gospel Fund. Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Advancement and Mobilization for ABWE International. Reunited again, and it feels so good with Scott Dunford, lead church planter for Redeemer Church in Fremont, California, and West Coast mobilizer. And finally, the weather in Pennsylvania has caught up to what it's probably always like out there in California. But Scott, I am sad because I received word today that you and I won't be seeing each other in San Diego for a conference we've both been planning to attend. So man, I'm sad. I wanted to see you. How are you, old friend?
I'm good. And, I took off my masks for this. And I know, Alex, you're probably wishing yours was on. But it's probably, it's sad that we're not going to be in San Diego. But imagine the tan line with that mask on your face the whole time.
Yes, so true. Maybe I should just, let's see here. I think I have a mask I can, this would be great for the listeners. Yeah, I think this would help a lot. Is this better? Does this improve my audio quality?
You sound more masculine, that's for sure.
Oh, well, then I'll keep it on. Well, speaking of masculine men, why don't you introduce our guest this week?
Oh, this is terrible. I am so sorry, Nathan. This is not the way it usually goes, but I guess we're feeling comfortable with you. I am excited to introduce to you someone I've gotten to know over the last few years, Nathan Sloan. I heard about Nathan interestingly years ago. I knew that he was working in Nepal. I had heard about the work that was going on there, and he came with a good reputation, but I never met him. And then a few years ago, we connected in Louisville, Kentucky, over lunch, and just was able to hear a little bit about his ministry, and then started putting dots together and realizing, oh, this is the same Nathan that I had heard about so many years ago. But Nathan is the pastor of sending at Sojourn Church in Midtown in Louisville, Kentucky, also the author of Multi-Site Mission Leadership. And he coaches mission leaders through an organization called the Upstream Collective, which we'll talk about in a little bit. He's in local church ministry. He's focused on that. He works on developing a healthy culture of sending, and excited to have him and talk a little bit about ministry in Nepal, but even more so right now, local church ministry. So welcome, Nathan, to the show. It's good to have you on.
Guys, it's so good to be with you. I love your podcast. It's evident you put a lot of time and energy into it. So it's an honor that you would ask me to be on the show. So thanks.
What are we paying him to talk us up? How much energy we put into it?
I'm glad he cut out time for us.
No, I'm about to make it bad. I'm going to tank the show is what I'm about to do.
Awesome.
Well, I'm nervous. Hey, Scott, can I just provide some initial, Scott, I know you wanted to ask the first question, but yeah, Nathan, you're the author of Multi-Site Missions Leadership. And I come from a background, I spent some time working in a multi-site church setting. And I'll be honest with you, you've probably seen what I've seen, which is that when churches go multi-site, there's just a tendency to completely disengage from missions. And I've seen that happen different ways. Sometimes it's, well, we're reaching our Jerusalem, and we'll let the smaller churches that have more, flex funds focus on reaching out overseas. We're going to be the, whether it's the seeker-driven church, or maybe it's just the fact that, hey, we really have to protect our Sunday morning programming, and maybe it's going out multi-site and we're getting streamed. And so we can't really be giving missionaries lots of pulpit time. And so missions gets relegated to second place. And I think there's so much there that could be done, whether or not you like or love multi-site. And I'm sure maybe there's different positions among our listeners on that. But I'm sure there's a lot of ways that we can improve that, those of us who are parts of churches that are like that. And is that some of the same things that you've seen that spurred you to get involved in this and start writing?
Yeah, I think as I was been leading a multi-site church in missions for the last 10 years, I'll often get questions about some of that. There is a generalization of multi-site churches don't care about mission. And I think some of that, there's truth to most generalizations, right? Some of that has come out of the infancy of multi-site, meaning, multi-site, the concept, the practice, the modern practice is not that old. And in its infancy, there's lots of mistakes, not just missions, but a lot of things, the elevation of personality and celebrity. But I think as the model has matured and been refined, I think one of the corrections that a lot of multi-site churches are bringing is this rediscovering of their responsibility in the Great Commission. For example, we could talk about a handful of churches that we all know and respect in missions, and they're multi-site. For example, a Bethlehem or an Austin Stone or a Summit. Mm-hmm. All those churches are multi-site, yet they're leading in many ways some of the ascending church conversation that we're going to be talking about. So it is a true generalization, but I think some of that stuff is changing. But there really wasn't anything written on leading missions in a multi-site church. So I just tried to bring some of my experience, some anecdotes, and then some interviews I had done with other leaders into this small ebook to provide help for mission pastors.
I appreciate that a lot. I think it's needed. From what I've seen, I think the stereotypes are true. I've seen where, hey, we might be larger, and so we have more access to funds, and so we can send a lot of money to projects. But as far as personally mentoring people, when the emphasis is on size and scalability, but we're going to mentor and personally send individual, independent church planting, traditional pioneering missionaries, that's where I've seen it be so difficult. So, hey, I'm excited to dive more into this and to hear about your background too.
Yeah.
So you didn't just get launched out of a cabbage patch with this heart for missions and a desire to help multi-site churches.
Launched out of a cabbage patch. That's a great mixture of metaphors.
Well, actually, that's exactly what happened to me. I used to live in a cabbage patch. How'd you know?
Well, you guys are too young to remember the Cabbage Patch Kids. I was reminded of that, but there was in the Michael Jordan documentary when they were saying he's more popular than Cabbage Patch Kids, and I'm like, most people listening to this don't even know why that was a phrase. But anyway, you didn't come from the Cabbage Patch, but you did come out of the mission world, and so you spent years in Nepal as a missionary. Can you just tell us a little bit about what it was like serving in Nepal, maybe kind of set us up for the next time we interview or we talk about missions in the Hindu world and maybe in Nepal particularly. But you served in Nepal before transitioning back to the States into your current role as pastor of sending. So what was your ministry like there, and how did it inform and help shape some of the things you're passionate about today in your current ministry?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's just so interesting, the Lord's sovereignty in these moments that in college, I spent my final semester working in Beijing, China, with a missionary who mentored me every day and taught me what it meant to share the gospel, make disciples in kind of a restricted access place. And he was a missionary with ABWE. And so when I thought about going long term, I had such a wonderful experience with the home office, with field personnel. There was no question to me. So I went with ABWE. I joined the team in Nepal, did language learning. We did a variety of things there. I served under a national partner, which was a wonderful experience. We had an orphanage that we helped serve, a local church, and then a Bible college. So most of what I did was developing Nepalis for ministry and then doing theological training in rural areas. So several of the men that I was discipling in ministry, we would go out into the kind of the foothills of the Himalayas, into villages where maybe there was a church present, maybe not. We would either share the gospel, we would do theological training. And actually that continues. I've been doing that for the last 12 years with a pastor named Hari, who's still associated with ABWE. He's planted a church in Kathmandu, and we've been able to train, quite a few churches and pastors, being able to give them resources. So theological training is kind of the the thrust of what I was able to do there.
So when you're in missions work, obviously you have good experiences, whether that's with your churches, with your agency. You can have some bad experience. When you come back into local church ministry in the States, and I know this was definitely true for me, having gone through something kind of similar. How did your experiences, good and bad, shape what you're doing now at Sojourn?
Yeah, we came back. I met my wife there. She was a single missionary as well. We came back to get married. It was during the recession of 2008, kind of raising support to go back. And as we were traveling, raising support, I was digging into the book of Acts, and the Spirit was doing these just really deep things. And I got to Acts 13, and I read the verses 1-4 about the elders praying and fasting, these men of God worshiping in unity together. And the Spirit of God spoke to them and called them to set apart two of their finest leaders for ministry. It said, set apart from me, Paul and Barnabas. It says they laid hands on them, they affirmed them, and they sent them out. So this picture of the local church sending through the power and instruction of the Holy Spirit, it hit me hard. And the Spirit began to do something in me. And this longing began to grow, because my experience was I had a call to international missions. I went to my pastor. My pastor's like, yes, that's great. What do you need me to do? I told him what to do. They had a commissioning service for me. They sent me out. I heard from them 3 years later. They didn't do a bad job as a sending church.
Right.
But what I saw in the scripture was something more, something richer. So I went to my pastor. I shared this vision. I went to my wife's pastor. We sat down with several churches here in Louisville and unpacked really Acts 11-18. And most of the pastors had the same response. This is a beautiful biblical picture, but for us to do this, we would have to turn our church upside down. And no one was willing to do it. And we were broken. I remember laying on the bed with my wife, getting a call from her pastor saying, we just can't do that. And basically I was asking, could we come on staff as interns, volunteer, serve? Could you pour into us? And could you send us out in a manner worthy of Acts 13, like a picture of this? I'll resign. I'll take a leave, whatever you want me to do. And no one is really willing to take that risk. So I just felt conviction. We resigned from ABWE, and it broke my heart, still does today. I took a job as a used car salesman to pay the bills. And I just trusted the Lord, like, Lord, if we're going to go out, I want to go out in an Acts 13 manner. Please show me the way. And we were attending a church plant at the time, Sojourn, and by God's grace, they wanted to get serious about mission. I think I was the closest body to that meeting where they were talking about hiring an international missions pastor. I remember doing my interview and I'm like, okay, here's my experience. Like, are you interviewing anybody else? They're like, nope, it's either you or nobody. I'm like, okay. They're like, no, it could be nobody. We haven't decided yet. And that's how it worked.
Thank God they hired you. That'd have been so demoralizing.
Yeah. When the number two choice is no one.
And I think
they went with the nobody.
Yeah. I think that's how it worked, It's just, I think that's how it worked is we saw conviction in scripture. We started handing out bulletins and serving coffee and just said, we want to commit our life to this vision. And that's what we've been doing ever since.
So you've already partly answered this, but what made Sojourn different? You're talking about so many churches, and it's not just multi-site churches, but I think we've probably all seen when churches get bigger, get more programmed, there is a tendency for missions to recede into the background. And you listed earlier some churches that aren't doing that. And we thank God for them. But what made Sojourn different? In your experience, what did you see that they were implementing that made them willing to pull the trigger on either hiring you or hiring your competitor, nobody?
I don't know if Sojourn's any different or special. I think the circumstances were a couple seminary students, along with some youth in our community, wanted to start a church for those who weren't being reached, musicians and artists. And really, we're committed to do that, and we're doing the hard work of that. One of the older people in that group, they may have been 30, was an MK from Ethiopia. And I don't know, 4 or 5 years into the church plant, he felt a call to go back as an adult, and he took his whole family, and we sent them out. And such a really young, impressionable church plant. It was a culture shaping moment to send out one of their founders to the mission field. And I think it kind of changed us forever, so that when I came on staff, there were 20 people from 18 to 35 who were saying, we want to go overseas long-term or short or midterm. Can you help us? Because part of the culture is there. Now we had to cultivate it and develop it, but our leaders led out in personal sacrifice. So I think that was one of the big things. And then we've always set aside a percentage of our dollars that were earmarked for missions, and we never touched that. Like that's never a discussion. So I think a commitment to finances is another one.
There's so much to think through with that. And, what are some of the things that you're trying to do that were different than you experienced your first go around? When you think of sending out a missionary, and we have Kelly Faber is working in Togo. She's an ABWE missionary doctor and sent out from Sojourn. What are you trying to do in like the life for her? What are you trying to do in her life and ministry that would be different than maybe what a lot of missionaries experience, or even what you experienced in your first go around?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say Kelly is a rock star, and she will beat me up for saying that, but
we all know it.
She has poured her life out for people. So I'm so privileged to be able to serve alongside her. I think as we kind of made that commitment to be in Acts 13, or really in Acts 11 through 18 church, the whole picture of Antioch. It's like, what does that mean? So it's not just the sending in Acts 13. There's this commitment, this long-term commitment to the sent one. And then as I continue to study, what does it mean to be a sending church? I get to the book of Philippians, where Paul writes this deep, intimate letter back to a church that sent him resources and personnel and letters. So it's like, okay, how do we reflect the book of Philippians? And I think that's what we're just committed to, is we're committed to identifying, raising up, assessing, developing, sending out, sustaining, receiving back our sent ones. And we want it to be a culture piece. We don't want it to be a department of the church. So that's where some of my missiology comes out, is I think biblically, every follower of Jesus is a sent one. Like if you are a disciple, your very identity has been changed to one who is pushed out on mission. And some of us take that cross-culturally. We have this unique call to cross language and culture. Some of us may take a job, in the Bay Area to help plant a church. And some of us may cross the street and share the gospel with our neighbor. But what does it mean to live out our sentness? So we have felt this unique call to call people to sacrifice, to cross culture and oceans to take the gospel. And then we want to create a kind of a petri dish to make that happen, where the norm is making radical steps. So in no way we shame people, but we want our college students and our retirees and everyone in between to look around and say, wow, the normative here is to sacrifice for the sake of the kingdom.
Wow. Well, we've got petri dishes and we've got cabbage patches, but there's some challenging things that you've mentioned here, and we want to dive more into that. I want to hear more about, you talked about to do this would turn your whole church on its head. You said some churches said that to you early on in the process. I want to talk to you when we come back from our break about that, so stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Scott Dunford, and I would like to share with you about a new nonprofit ministry established to help churches, Christian schools, and other ministries protect children and prevent abuse. Rich Hamar from Church Law and Tax states that the number one reason that drives churches to court is child sexual abuse. I can't think of anything more devastating to these lives, their families, and our witness before a watching world than sexual abuse that takes place in ministry. The traumatic impact often leaves the vulnerable not wanting anything to do with God or his people. Furthermore, as ministry leaders, our efforts toward evangelism, discipleship, and spiritual formation are not only neutralized, but shattered. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention was formed last year to help ministry leaders understand the complexities of child protection and abuse prevention. They are establishing standards and an accreditation program that will help verify that appropriate measures are in place at your church or ministry. Learn more about them and their good work at abuseprevention.org. Find a helpful and free assessment tool to help you see how you measure up in this area. Go to abuseprevention.org and click on the link for this resource assessment. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention. Pray for them and follow along for this accreditation program coming soon.
Brooks Buser, president of Radius International.
Today I have the privilege of having a conversation with Ian Hamilton, board member of the Banner of Truth and professor at Greenville Presbyterian Seminary.
I find it hard to express this, but the brief time over the last 2 years that I've had in contact with Radius has been a signal moment, actually, in my Christian life for myself and my wife, Joan. But to see young lives gladly giving themselves to decades of language study, culture acquisition, knowing that it may take 5, 10, 15 years before they can meaningfully set before this language group the grace and love of God in Jesus Christ. That's just been very moving for me, and I regularly am thankful to God for the privilege of having a little contact with Radius.
Go to radiusinternational.org, radiusinternational.org.
And we're back with Nathan Sloan from Sojourn Midtown in Louisville, Kentucky. And actually, I know we're coming through the web, but feel the need to, I don't feel distanced enough. Let me get my mask on again. And okay, I'm feeling a little bit better here. But all kidding aside, Nathan, grateful for you and your experience that you bring to the equation of what does it mean to be a sending church. Earlier, you talked about the fact that when you first started rolling out your vision for what it meant biblically to send, and that sort of Acts 1 or Acts 11 through 18 kind of style, and what you see in Acts 13, and they're praying and fasting and laying hands on people, and pastor is saying to you, hey, this would be great, but this would cause our church a lot of pain. What are those pain points? Because I don't think anyone listening to this says, yeah, we really don't want to engage in missions that intentionally, but there's real sacrifices to do this. There's other things that you probably can't do as a church. Well, how would you walk people through? What are those sacrifices for churches, big or small?
Yeah. And I think the best way to answer that question is really to bring up this concept of the sending church. I think you talk to any pastor or someone in ministry or a layman in the church, and they would say, yes, we care about missions. We care about, the nations. And that's all true. And I believe that. But I think some of the distinction of what a sending church is a church that takes ownership and responsibility in raising up, sending out, and sustaining church planners, international missionaries, their own people, really across the spectrum, workplace into the neighborhood. So when we talk about sacrifice, I'm thinking things like we don't just push missions into a department. Now, we do need structure. We need to put it in a category. I get that. But what I'm talking about is like, there are things in every church that are a part of our culture. Good theology, the value of children's ministry, music, whatever it might be for your church. But to bring reaching the nations, making disciples, planting churches to the forefront, or the language we use here is when I came on staff, some of the things that we're really good as a church is preaching the word, faithfully bringing exposition. I think another was music, arts, really valuing the arts. We still have an art gallery. These were kind of pillars of our church. They're the foundations that our church is built upon. And I really wanted missions to be a pillar or a foundation of our church, really a cultural foundation. And I remember saying that early on, saying, man, my dream is that when people think of Sojourn Midtown, they think of a church that is for the nations, that sacrifices for the nations. And I remember a few years ago hearing one of our pastors, maybe it was our lead pastor, talk, and he was articulating, these are the things that we value. These are the things that we'll like, our hills that we'll die on, international missions. And it hit me as like, oh man, we did it. Like it's a culture shaping piece of our church. It informs everything we do. So like right now, our elders tonight, we're having an elder meeting. We're going to talk about the budget. It's budget season. Our physical year starts July 1st. And a conversation is like, oh, okay, where are we going to put priority? What is valuable to us? And global missions and church planning always comes up. And whenever it does, it's just shows me that it's a part of our culture. So that's what I would say. Like when we talk about sacrifice, it means that it moves to the forefront. It has to, for it to really make an impact globally.
So one of the initiatives that you're a part of that helps with that is something called the Upstream Collective. What is that exactly? And how does that help in accomplishing this vision of healthy, engaged, sending churches that are not just sending them out and hoping they do well, but actually engaged in the mission with their missionaries? What is the Upstream Collective?
Yeah, that's a great question. For years, I don't think people had a box for it because obviously it's not a local church. It's not a sending agency. And then in the missions world, what else are you? Like, where do you fit? But I mean, the history was like two missionaries who lived in Spain really saw that local churches were not engaged globally well. And part of that, they weren't given a seat at the table when it came to strategy, mission decisions, sending out their own people. So they started this like ragtag group of people who really wanted to elevate the position of the local church in mission, and really to bring definition and clarity to the sending church, to churches that take ownership and responsibility in sending people. So one of those guys, Larry McCrary, kind of came off the field. He's now the executive director. Caleb Kreider, still in global missions, works for an agency. And then there's about 9 of us. I'm the director of the board, and I do some speaking and writing, and there's others who fulfill different roles. So we're probably still a ragtag group, but really the whole goal is to empower local churches to send their people well, and then to push the sending church movement to the forefront of missions. And we think that's happening. We think a lot of churches are kind of catching on to this sending vision.
Shifting gears slightly, what advice or encouragement would you give to a small church pastor? You're there in the heart of maybe not the heart, but the lungs of the Bible Belt. I mean, you're in an area where you're surrounded by, a seminary and multiple churches, and you're a part of a larger network. But what about the small church pastor who, I'm thinking of my own church, and we've got like 50 people. We've got a missions team that loves missions, cares about it, and God's blessed us with financial resources. But the idea of building a culture of missions right now, it's like, man, can we even have church with everything that's going on and governor's orders and that which shall not be named, the virus that's spreading, all those sorts of things? What would you say to the small church pastor about building this kind of culture?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is often a pushback I get when I talk about sending church and having ownership and responsibility in sending people. People respond, well, that sounds good, but that's really a big church thing, right? You can only do that if you have multiple staff members and you have people with advanced degrees and you have $1 million budget. And I just don't think that's true. I think at the core of this, we're talking about principles and missiology, and the outworking of that can contextualize. I mean, it can look different. For example, let's take your pastor or your missions committee of a church of 50 people. If I got on a call with, let's say, your missions committee, and we're talking through these things, I'm not going to say, hey, here at Sojourn, we do X, Y, and Z. You should do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to walk you through some principles. At the Upstream Collective, we call them the sending church elements. There's 17 elements that we believe a sending church should strive for. Now, nobody does them well, but some of them are like whole church engagement. How do you get your whole church caring about missions? Or strategic engagement. How are you as a church strategically involved in missions? And I'm not talking about missionary support. I mean, how is your church engaging the nations for the kingdom in a strategic way? So some of the ways we articulate this is the difference between a shotgun approach and a rifle approach, meaning a rifle is more direct and specific. So encouraging your church to think through that principle. So this is what I would say is there are advantages to being a large church with a large budget, a large staff. Sure. I think there's advantages to a small church. For example, we have several dozen missionaries that we've raised up and sent out of Sojourn. And I can only give so much attention to those or disciple those or provide care for those people. But at a church of 50, if you're able to send out 1 or 2 or partner with 1 or 2, you're able to give a lot more relational attention. Or maybe you take on one mission project. You can really focus in and develop a culture around that specific project or that specific location. So that's what I would say is I think my pushback to that pushback is don't think projects, activities, staffing, money, think principles. How do we take these principles of sending church and to apply them to the context that we live in, no matter what size church we have?
Yeah, I think sometimes, we can see like a big church decides, hey, we're gonna bring all of missions in house. We're gonna support every missionary 100%. We're gonna basically run a small mission agency out of our church. And little churches go, like I could never do that, and I don't think I'd want to do that. And yet I can even just speak from experience. There were pastors that maybe even weren't our sending church, but that were super engaged. They knew what was going on in our ministry. They would call or do at that time Skype was popular and used Skype a lot and asked hard questions. We'd come and visit. I mean, they just really leaned into our ministry and were super engaged. And these were small churches with less than 100 people. And there's a lot of ways that small churches can be engaged. So I really appreciate that encouragement there. I want to,
yeah, amen.
I want to come from another angle. I mean, we did our missions roundtable discussion, and one of the pushbacks we got was, "Hey, where are the local church pastors?" And of course, like, you know, I was a little bit offended because just because I'm in a small church doesn't mean I'm not a pastor.
We got pushback. What? we got pushback.
Hey guys, people were listening. That's encouraging, right?
I know, right? That's what we were talking earlier. And I'm like, hey, you know, as part of pushback, you're like, hey, I can't believe someone listened and that they would even care and that they might even want to be on our show. Like, this is amazing. But certainly, you know, like, we care about local church. I'm a pastor. Alex is very engaged in his local church. Paul David, we can go on and on about caring about this, but it does.
Yeah, I'm not a pastor, but I play one in the internet.
Very engaged in ministry. And but on the other side of it, it does bring up the fact that within the missions world, there can be this real siloing of information and communication, where agencies are kind of doing their thing, and maybe they're engaging with the academy, and there's reasons for that, right? Like, you know, we need each other, and there's a lot of time to think, but also potential missionaries and blah, blah, blah. And churches, there's thousands of them. Even ABWE, which is, you know, a large, medium to large mission, isn't as big as IMB or as big as Pioneers or something like that, but still pretty large. I mean, we've got thousands of sending churches, and it's hard to engage with every pastor in the way that you would want to. So my question is, as a pastor heavily engaged in missions and missions training, and you're involved in the academy, but also someone who spent time on the mission field, what do you think that mission agencies like an ABWE or some of the other ones we've mentioned need to hear from churches that are passionate about sending? What would be your critique and challenge?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And, you know, it's the danger here is, like a lot of things that we could talk about, is we could generalize. So, you know, I could say, well, where's a local church guy? And you're like, well, I am a local church guy. And it's like, well, that's not what I meant. I meant this, you know. So you'd have to hear me in the same way. I think when I talk to agency guys, or even I talk to you guys, it's like I talk sending church, I talk these ideas, and I hear some of the same pushback. Well, you know, ABWE, we have 5,000 churches that support our sent ones. How are we going to help every church? And then insert whatever, a little bit antiquated argument. And it's just true thing, right?
Sure.
But this is what I would say. There are a lot of churches, and that number is growing out there, who are saying, we are taking back ownership and responsibility in missions, and we want to work hand in hand with agencies. So that's what I would say. Sometimes when I have this conversation with people, they say, oh, are you saying churches want to send their own people and support them 100%? That's not what I'm saying. There are like 1 out of 1,000 churches that I talk to. That's not really true, because I don't talk to 1,000 churches, but you get what I mean? Like a small percentage. No. A small percentage of churches I talk to are saying, we want to do everything. What most churches are saying, we love our agencies. We have good relationships. However, sometimes we get lip service, or sometimes they don't know what to do with us. We say, hey, we want to be involved in the assessment process, or, hey, we don't like that method of personality profiling, or we don't like this, or we'd rather use this, or, hey, when a care situation happens in the field, we want to be notified and involved, or can we work hand in hand? And often agencies are like, I don't really know what to do with you. I'll give you an example. We have sent several of our people through a very large agency. We had a crisis happen on the field. I spent a week trying to get a hold of the right person, signing HIPAA documents, getting all the permissions we could so that we could be a joint force to help this family. And I remember the first conversation I had with the head of member care, again, very large organization. And one of his first words to me is like, we've never worked hand in hand with the church before like this. Now, some of it's because there was no pathway. I had to like create a pathway.
Yeah.
Some churches don't know there's an opportunity, but all that to say, I think there is maybe a misunderstanding between agencies and churches. there are a growing number of churches who say, hey, we don't have all the answers, but we want a seat at the table. So right now I'm working with an agency to deal with the situation on the field. And again, similar, they've had very few churches who want to work with us. So I just proposed this idea. I said, hey, as we're working on this issue on the field, what if we have a task force and there's people from the local church and the agency on it together? We make decisions together and then we roll it out. And they're like, can we do that? I'm like, yes, we can work collaboratively to make this happen. So I know not every church wants to do that, but there are some, and that number is growing because the sending church movement, the principles behind it, the desire for churches to have ownership and a seat at the table is growing. And maybe it started at some larger churches with staffing, but more and more as I coach mission pastors, there are churches of 300, 500, 250 who are saying, hey, I read your book, or I heard from a friend of a friend, and we want to start doing missionary care, or we feel like we could host perspectives and then add some stuff to the assessment piece. How did you do that? So that movement and those ideas are generating. So if I'm talking to an agency leader, this is what I would say. It's already happening. It's not 5 churches. It's not 500 churches. It's 5,000 churches, or whatever the number might be. And not every church that an agency works with or serves is going to want this. Some don't, right? They just want to write a check. But if agencies could create a pathway to communication and deeper engagement, they're going to be surprised by how many churches want to engage at a deeper level. So there's an opportunity here for both the church and the agency to figure this next movement of mission sending out, because I think there is a shift happening in how it all plays out. I think that shift is happening.
And I think what you're saying is true on so many levels, because in other segments of culture, that's what you see continuing to happen. You see churches derelicting on their biblical duty, and other institutions fill the vacuum because nature abhors a vacuum. But then the process of transitioning back to local church care and oversight is messy. I think of entitlements in our country and even government, and thinking about care and benevolence. But if the churches historically in our land had been faithful to minister to the poor and have a biblical diaconate, would we have a welfare state? I mean, and I'm making a comparison because I think it's similar. When we get used to a parachurch doing what the church is called to do, then it creates painful transitions later. So here's a question that I think dovetails. If you could just wave a magic wand, which who wouldn't want to, over the whole North American church and landscape of missions, what would you change?
Yeah, you've told me that question beforehand, but I'm still kind of...
It's a big one, isn't it?
I'm like a deer in headlights. Because I guess this is what I would say. I don't want to come across as that guy who's like, well, I'd change everything. It's all messed up. But then I don't want to be like, everything's great. We're all wonderful.
Yeah.
I think the reality is there are many wonderful agencies out there who are struggling to figure out how to shift to the change in mission sending. I talk to them. You've talked to them, right? Like, I think the world is changing. I think the church structures are changing. I think finances are changing. Who knows what COVID is going to bring, what changes are going to be necessitated in nonprofits because of this next season. We don't know. And I think in the same way, churches. So I wish I could sit with agency leaders and say, give voice to the church, add a seat to the table, listen to the people who are developing and cultivating the hearts and characters of the people you send, because they probably have a lot of insight for you. And then even in strategy, like listen to the church. What's the vision that God's given to the church? I would say like create space, have conversations for the church that want to have that voice. And then for the churches, they don't even know that they could have a voice. Let them know they could have a voice. And then if I could sit with my mission pastor brothers and sisters and my friends and say, I know we want the church to be more involved, but let's be patient. Let's be gracious. Let's start conversations. Let's build relationships. Like, and that's one of the things I told Scott. Like I was a part of that hubbub on Twitter. Like, hey, we're all the local missions guys. And I think some of the tension there was not that we don't love the people on the panel. I know all those guys. Those are great guys. And it's not because we don't love you guys. I think it's because the church, local church mission guys often have their chip on their shoulder saying, hey, like there's something to learn in our little world. So if I consider those guys, I would just say, hey guys, like let's keep pounding the table. Let's keep graciously sharing the insights we have. A shift is happening. So let's be gracious to one another. So, and I don't want to be a doomsday guy. I think good things are happening. Yes, go ahead.
Can I hop in with something else here too? I keep thinking of other areas where we can apply this, that the church has maybe stepped out of something and now wants to step back in, and we've got to figure out how to do that well. Missions, caring for the poor. Can I throw another one out there? Education, seminary, right? We've delegated that to seminaries. And how long is that going to last in the economic culture of our day and all the disruptions? Yeah. And that goes to missionaries, because how do you train and educate missionaries, right? Again, some of these things have to go back to churches.
Yeah, I think we see that happening. I think most of the seminaries I follow or connected to are trying to figure out education in the 21st century. And I think a lot of churches are saying, well, a lot of theological, missiological training could happen within our church. So I don't know what the answer is there either, but you're right. That's another great example.
Well, I am thankful for, the pushback. I mean, certainly sometimes whenever you get pushback, you take it personally.
I'm not.
But in the sense that having these conversations and even just being able to having you being able to express some of these things, in this kind of conversation, I think all of us go like, yeah, that's what we want. Like I think even from an agency side or from a pastoral side, whichever hat I'm wearing at the time, we know that what you're saying is biblically true. Like the mission is the local churches, and it has to be driven by the local church. And an agency is just a practical necessity in this modern world. But how do we fight to keep it as biblically oriented as possible and as local church centered as possible? So it's also reproducible, because that's one of the problems. Like what we are doing in America isn't very reproducible, in Nepal, for instance. Whereas a local church is very reproducible and a sending body that is engaged can come up with solutions to these problems. And so I'm thankful for you leaning into this. I'm thankful for our mission pastor friends who listen, engage. We want to continue that. And I just want to encourage mission pastors or even senior pastors that are out there that are feeling frustrated with their agency, knowing the leaders of some of these agencies, they do want to hear from you. And you'd be kind of surprised, how seldomly some of these agency leaders hear from pastors when it isn't a crisis. It's just, hey, I want to lean into this discussion. Mm-hmm. And so, Nathan, thank you for answering God's call, both to Nepal, but also to Louisville. And thank you for being engaged in helping to kind of coordinate and being involved in this movement of having local churches own their sending responsibility.
Yeah. And let me throw something in real quick too. As far as next steps, if you're a pastor or maybe you work for a ministry and some of this is resonating with you, one thing you could ask is, okay, if there is a crisis happening, and certainly there's somewhat of a crisis happening right now, you might have heard, cut the red tape. What would it look like if, I'm even thinking for myself, if we had pastors calling us at ABWE and saying, hey, give me a HIPAA form I can sign, give me something so that I can be more involved in care and management of these things. Is there too much red tape for people to get through, or are there pathways that you can create in advance so that when people like Nathan come in as pastors, we can all work together? Because Nathan, you're not saying, do away with institutions. You're just saying, hey, churches want to be involved and let's do this together. And Nathan, how can people get more of what you've written, what you've said on some of this? How can people follow you?
Well, I speak and write for the Upstream often. And like I said, I have that book, Multi-Site Missions Leadership. I would actually point you to better and smarter people than me. So a couple book recommendations. There's a book called The Sending Church Defined by Zach Bradley that really unpacks this idea of sending church in real practical, winsome ways. There's a few other books out there. One's called Gaining by Losing by J.D. Greer, about the culture at Summit that he has shaped. And then if you get into the nuts and bolts of actually sending, there's a mission pastor named Steve Byrne, who's really one of the fathers of kind of the mission pastor world. He's out of Pennsylvania. He wrote a book called Well Sent and kind of unpacks his ministry over the years of how they've developed an amazing sending church there. So those are 3 books: The Sending Church Defined, Gaining by Losing, and Well Sent, that I would point you to.
Sweet. We will put those in the show notes. Nathan, thank you for your time, and enjoy life in Louisville there. Watch for the nail strips when you leave the church parking lot. And thank you for listening to the Missions Podcast today. To get more content, go to missionspodcast.com or check out abwe.org/podcast. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share. To ask a question or suggest a topic, email alex@missionspodcast.com, and we'll see you next time on the Missions Podcast.